This is a photo of Tucson, Arizona, the community where I live, taken from a mountain looking down into the Santa Cruz River Valley with the Catalina Mountains in the background. This region relies on water from the Colorado River, which flows south to the Gulf of California. As the river flows south, it runs through a suite of dams, which create reservoirs for water storage while also providing hydroelectric power for the Southwest. Lake Havasu in the northwestern part of our state is the closest such reservoir relative to Tucson. Because the lake is so far away, water has to be delivered to where I live through an open-air canal known as the Central Arizona Project, or CAP. The CAP runs through the desert over a distance of 336 miles before reaching Tucson. Because Tucson is located at a higher elevation relative to Lake Havasu, the CAP requires that water be pumped uphill 2,900 feet. The challenge is summarized in this video clip hosted by the general manager for CAP.
So the water has to be pumped uphill, right out of the Lake Havasu. It's pumped uphill several hundred feet. We have 14 pumping plants along the way to help pump it up.
All this pumping requires lots of energy, 90% of which is supplied by the Navajo Generating Station, which supplies energy for customers in Arizona, Nevada, and California. Of interest, CAP demands 24.3% of the Navajo Generating Station's total service output. At the same time, we're currently in our 19th year of drought in the Southwest. Impacts can be witnessed in the bathtub ring that's forming around one of our most important reservoirs on the Colorado River, Lake Mead. Although Tucson relies on the CAP for groundwater recharge, it also happens to be located in one of the wettest deserts in the world, receiving 12 inches of rain per year. The challenge is that half of our annual rainfall occurs during the summer monsoon via short, intense bursts. So without a means to store all that free water locally, we lose much of it to surface runoff, which mostly evaporates. So how can we hold this water in place to offset a reliance on imported water? One way is to remove hard surfaces and gently contour the land to create basins and swales, so that when rain falls, it slows and has an opportunity to infiltrate. We can also pursue active rainwater harvesting by storing water that falls from the sky in containers that can be tapped when needed during drier periods of the month. An old garbage can with a lid or even a 5-gallon bucket will ensure those drops of rainwater make it to the right place. Now, you might think that modest water harvesting efforts like these are not significant, but consider this container weighs over 350 pounds when full. That's over 350 pounds of water that fell free from the sky rather than being pumped uphill 2,900 feet through an open canal running through the desert, while requiring fossil fuels for pumping the same. As such, this is a pretty good start. Having said that, you can see from this video that I also lose a lot of water during the heavier rainfall events. I'm capturing some of the runoff through 2 rainwater harvesting basins located downstream of the overflow. As you can see in this photo, that water is being put to good use to support a fruit tree, which is rarely watered from municipal supplies given all that rainwater that gets stored in the soil. Any water that spills out of that first basin makes it into a second basin that hosts desert natives. Regardless, I decided it would still be useful to supplement the storage associated with this modest container. I was fortunate to have a friend who had a line on some used, empty 55-gallon plastic drums. My friend works for an auto dealership, and these drums were originally used to deliver car wash shampoo. So I was happy to reclaim these for beneficial use rather than seeing them get landfilled. In addition, I decided to build this stand in order to realize a head on the barrels, and thus make it easier to deliver water throughout my yard by simply attaching a hose to this hose bib. This system is fairly easy and inexpensive to build, so in the following slides, I'll demonstrate how I put one together. For the stand, you'll want to use 2x4s cut to the lengths shown on this slide for this particular structure, and you'll need a box of 2.5 or 3-inch wood screws to tie everything together. Depending on your source for barrels, you'll most definitely want to make sure that they didn't contain anything hazardous to begin with, or you might risk doing more damage than good. Empty soap barrels are relatively safe, so I'm not too concerned about rinsing and reusing these in my yard, but make sure to read any labels on the barrel carefully, and if you're not confident about what they were originally used for, avoid them altogether. If you can't find reclaimed materials that are safe to use, you can always pick these up online for relatively cheap. So the following slides just show an inventory of the plumbing that I used to connect to my barrels and to have them connected to one another. You don't have to follow this setup exactly, but I'm just basically outlining what I used in my setup here. And for your tools, it's helpful to have a jigsaw with a fine-tooth blade, carpenter's tape, and a chopper or skill saw for cutting your 2x4s to length for your stand, a drill with a Phillips bit for drilling your screws into your wood, and also a 3/4-inch paddle bit to drill into your bungs. It also helps to have a bung wrench for removing and attaching bungs to your barrel, and channel locks or a pipe wrench for tightening your fittings onto your tank. If you don't have these materials or tools, you might consider visiting a local hackerspace for the same. I found most of what I needed was readily available, thus minimizing demand for new materials. Next, I'll show you how those 2x4s are tied together for the barrel stand. And just a note to add a screw here where I have it noted, it'll tie things together a little bit better. Next, you're going to want to determine where to place that stand and barrel relative to the water being delivered by your scupper. And take care in doing this. I wasn't very careful the first time, and I ended up having to do a little bit of extra digging to get this just right. So once you've determined where you're going to place that stand, go ahead and scrape back any gravel or overburden and get down to bare ground. And to help me level things out, what I did was I went to a different part of my yard where I needed a basin for water harvesting, and I collected some dirt from there so that I could basically backfill that area where the gravel had been removed and tamp it down so I could create a nice hard level foundation. And you can see here that once the area is relatively level, I place some bricks down to put a little bit of elevation on my stand so that it's not resting in water after a rainfall event. And once you're satisfied with the placement of your foundation bricks, go ahead and place your stand on the same and recheck everything for a level. I happen to have some stain that was left over from another project in my garage, and I thought this is a great way to get rid of it. So I stained my stand. You don't have to do this. And then I went ahead and I applied a coat of polyurethane to help make it a little bit more weatherproof. As far as preparing the barrels goes, turn them upside down and you're going to cut the bottom of the barrel. When I say bottom, I'm talking about the side of the barrel that doesn't have the bungs associated with it. We're going to tie into those bungs for our plumbing. So in order to help get the jigsaw blade into the barrel, I drilled a little hole, and then I just basically put my jigsaw blade in that hole and then cut along the line. And here you can see that the bottom of my barrel's been cut off. There's a little bit of residual soap in there, which I put inside a plastic bag and will basically use for washing my cars on another day. And this is just to show you how you can use that piece of plastic that you cut off the bottom of the barrel. I put a piece of PVC pipe in the middle of it to kind of stiffen it up, and I can use it as another lid now. My barrels were a little dirty, so I took a little bit of dish soap and used the same to kind of clean them up to make them look a little bit more attractive. And since these barrels are plastic and they'll be in the sun, I took the initiative to treat them with some UV resistant clear coat. Next, go ahead and turn your barrel over, and you'll notice that you'll have two bungs to work with for attaching your PVC fittings. Most of these bungs typically have a 3/4 inch threaded female socket, which you can tie into. If your bung doesn't, you can always purchase one on Amazon that is threaded. You will need that threading to tie your plumbing into. And this is just to show you that once that fitting is threaded into that bung, you're going to have plenty of room underneath that stand to do pretty much anything you need to do with your PVC plumbing. Next, go ahead and drill 3/4 inch holes in both bungs of your first barrel, taking care not to damage the inside threads. Now, since these bungs are going to be subject to some water pressure, I recommend applying a little bit of Teflon tape. In fact, apply Teflon tape around all of your threaded fittings associated with your PVC plumbing. And this slide is just to demonstrate that in order for any extension tube to clear the barrel stand, we need to insert a little 2-inch pipe between the elbow fitting and the extension coming out of the bung. And this slide summarizes the plumbing that's going to be used to attach the first barrel to the second, and it includes an optional flush should you wish to empty out your barrel quickly for cleaning or for some other reason. And this is the plumbing for the second bung hole on the first barrel. Make sure that on this one that you include an elbow with a slip fitting rather than a threaded fitting as is shown here. And once your elbow is installed in the bung, go ahead and attach an 11-inch piece of PVC so that you can extend a threaded fitting out to the front of your stand, and we'll attach a hose bib to that threaded fitting. And this slide shows what the plumbing looks like on the bottom of my first barrel. You can see that one bung is being used to extend the hose bib out to the front of my stand, and the second bung is being used to daisy chain my first barrel to my second barrel, and then I've included an optional flush should I wish to empty this barrel quickly. And here you can see the first barrel resting on the stand. Notice that I've got my hose bib coming out near the center of the stand, and I do this because it's a little bit easier to daisy chain the second barrel to the first barrel if I do so from opposite ends of the stand. And the plumbing for my second barrel is relatively easy. All I'm going to do is put an elbow on this with a hose barb that I can tie my vinyl tubing to. And with respect to the second barrel, I'm not going to cut the bottom of the barrel off. Instead, I'm going to drill a hole in it, and that will allow pressure to be relieved when both barrels are daisy chained together. And here you can see that I've attached some flexible vinyl hosing from one barrel to the second using those barbs. So this shows the hose going from my first barrel to my second barrel. Here you can see that I've inserted an optional ball valve to basically control flow between both barrels. You don't really need this. I just happen to have an extra ball valve and two barbs. The only benefit I get from this is if I'm going to have a small storm, I can close the ball valve and make it easier to build a higher head on the first barrel. Hi folks, I just wanted to follow up on this project 2 weeks into it. I have been using this water around my yard, although it's been a little bit tedious because what I've had to do is use a bucket and then basically fill it off that hose bib, and the flow isn't really that great. So it takes time to fill the bucket, and then I gotta kind of haul it all over the yard. So I'm not using this water as quickly as I should be, and as a result, it's kind of stagnating and growing algae. So to solve that problem, I wanted to see what I could do with one of these clear water pumps. This pump was left over from my biodiesel homebrewing days way back when, just sitting in the garage gathering dust. I think you can pick these up at Harbor Freight for maybe 30 or 40 bucks. So what I did was I hooked it up to the flush. Now when I open that ball valve and put power on this pump, I actually get some pressure that allows me to use the hose around the yard. Makes it a lot easier to use the water, and it'll help me make sure that it just doesn't sit around and stagnate. So I'm going to open up the ball valve on this bypass plumbing, and what the flow looks like normally under the pressure head being released by those barrels. You can see it's pretty slow. So I just turn this on full, and you can see what a difference that makes. That makes it a lot easier to distribute that water around my yard. Of course, I wouldn't normally be doing this in the middle of the day when most of this water is going to be subject to evaporation. I'd do this early in the morning, or maybe hook it up to some kind of a timer, but just kind of gives you an idea that there are alternatives to bypassing the low pressure that's being realized by these tanks. So you can use that water a little bit easier rather than having it just being stored and growing algae in your tank. So in this video, I suggested running a line around the outside of the barrel and cutting the top off. After building another one of these for my neighbor, I realized it doesn't make any sense to cut from the sides since you'll be losing storage from the plastic that's removed. It makes more sense to cut the barrel opening from the flat part on the top. That will translate into more water stored during your next rainfall event. Finally, I'd recommend removing this hose bib, which doesn't work very well under the pressure realized by the system, and just use the ball valve for draining water from the barrels, as I'll demonstrate on my neighbor's setup. All right, so I've had this set up probably for about 9 months. I must have filled these barrels both up at least 10 times over the season. We've had pretty good rains this year, so it's been really helpful for watering my plants as an alternative to using the utility, saving me a little bit of money and helping out with the environment. I thought I'd just point out a couple things. One is I have not painted these barrels, and as a result, because they're a little translucent, when they fill up, I do get this red algae that grows on the inside of the barrel. Not a big deal, doesn't really affect performance. You can't really tell too much when the barrels are full and when you've got a lid on them. But regardless, it's just something to keep in mind. If that bothers you, you might want to paint them. For me, it hasn't really impacted performance that much. The other thing is these little faucets. They're really nice because you can hook up a hose, but they must be designed to regulate the pressure that comes out of the utility, because they flow really slow. So I wouldn't really recommend using these. I'd really recommend using the ball valves. So that'll save you a little bit of money too if you only have one of these. Just eliminate that altogether. And you can see here that the treatment on the wood's kind of worn off. It's been out here for a while, but the wood's holding up fine. I don't have any termites. No issues on that front, so that's a good sign. Quickly, I wanted to show you guys the setup that I built for my neighbor, who actually provided me with barrels. So it's basically the same deal. Since his is outside and since we're part of an HOA, I went ahead and I painted the stand. the same color as the house, so I wouldn't draw too much attention to it. You can tell here that I cut the top off a little different, so that's going to increase the capacity on the barrel. So what he's doing is he's basically letting this system fill up, as you can see, off that scupper up there, and then he's got this hose that goes into his backyard, and he's growing some vegetables back there, and when he needs some water, he just gently opens up this ball valve, and this actually goes into some water harvesting basins where he's growing some vegetables right now. So that's working really well for him. So the changes I made on this one were I cut the top off a little bit higher, and I got rid of those faucets, used a ball valve instead, and the bottom is a lot simpler, as you can see. So I'm just using tubing to daisy chain the two barrels, and I just have this one ball valve coming out. So much simpler.
All day I faced a barren waste without the taste of water, cool water.